His Excellency Tony Kevin, for joining us again on the mother of all talk shows. Ambassador, I was robbed of the opportunity of asking you this last time, but this time is even more apposite because the extradition of your compatriot, Julian Assange, would appear to be absolutely imminent. It looks like the British have failed the cause of freedom in this case. And it seems like Australia never really got out of the blocks in trying to rescue your own citizen from this trumped-up case, which may very well see him behind bars for the rest of his life. To what do you attribute the Australian government's apparent lackadaisical approach to this?
Good to be back on the show, George, and I look forward to a longer discussion with you on this and other interesting topics. Assange is Australia's shame, our shame that we have not effectively done anything to help him over the last few years. Quite the contrary. In fact, our governments, both of them, have given surreptitious signals to Britain and America, do what you wish with him. We are really compliant with whatever you do. There is a little bit of light in the tunnel. I won't say at the end of the tunnel, but somewhere in the tunnel, there's a multi-party group of Australian MPs going to Washington in the next few days to make a last-ditch personal appeal to whoever they can see in the American government to say, release the man, end this tragic farce. And that's an important event, I think, even though they are not members of the government. They're backbenchers from different parties, including, interestingly, the former leader of the Nationals Party, Barnaby Joyce, who's quite a colourful character. But anyway, it's a multi-party delegation, and hopefully it may achieve something.
And yet Australia had this enormous leverage. It is, as we discussed last time, albeit briefly, the most obedient satrap of the United States, even to the point of self-harm on a spectacular level. I mean, the self-harm Australia has done to itself over China and the whole AUKUS and the nuclear submarines and all the rest. You'd think, I mean, I was a friend of Bob Hawke for my sins and his. Bob would have had his jacket off, over the chair, sleeves rolled up, and like a trade union negotiator as he was, he'd have said, we're doing all this for you, you buggers. You're going to have to do this one thing for us and give us back Julian Assange. They never made any use of this leverage.
No, they're a very timid bunch. They're terribly fearful of offending, I guess, Biden and the fanatical apparatchiks around Biden. There's this fear that Australia is very vulnerable to American political manipulation at the domestic level. It's a well-founded fear because quite a lot of our political class have been pretty much indoctrinated and subverted by America over the years. And I'm talking about our political class from both major parties. So America showed its power when they destroyed the prime ministership of Gough Whitlam. They showed their power again a short time later when they put thumbs down on Bill Hayden becoming prime minister at the lead of a victorious Labor Party. And I have to add, George, despite your personal admiration for the man, Bob Hawke was America's choice as Australian Prime Minister. And Bob Hawke went on to do a great deal of work for the Americans in terms of the Let My People Go campaign to get Soviet Jews out of Russia and into Israel. So he's not the perfect person in my book by any means, but we could set that aside. It's not an important difference in the context we're in now. We do have to ask ourselves in Australia, where are we going? And unfortunately, our political class is supine, frightened, compliant. There's very little good to see in the Albanese government at the moment, I'm afraid.
Sounds a bit like Downing Street. No, I was making the Bob Hawke point that Bob would never pass up the opportunity to have a good negotiating victory. He was, of course, on many things, highly deficient, and you have adumbrated some of them. I could adumbrate still more. But the one thing he was a trader, was a negotiator. And when you've got a hand like Australia has got, and you're only asking for one thing, to have a journalist released, it's pretty pathetic that they didn't play that hand at all.
It's more than pathetic. It's shameful. It's ridiculous. There is so much anger now in Australia outside government circles. There is a growing radical movement. It's still small, but it's very committed. And I feel proud in my own small way to be a part of it. I'm not much of a person to wave placards at demonstrations. I'm getting a bit old and frail for that. But I try to use my brain, and I try to use my pen or my key punching fingers to make a contribution. And there's more and more of us now. I mean, we have some outstanding characters like Caitlin Johnston at Kate Oz on Twitter, who makes a remarkable contribution to the global dialogue. And there are others. John Menachie, who runs the Pearl. Wonderful people. So I feel that there is a little bit of hope for Australia yet. We're not completely on our backs yet.
Well, one hopes not, of course. Let's turn to the problems that other people have. In Ukraine, in the last 72 hours, the defense minister has been fired and sent to be ambassador at the court of St. James in London. His parting shots were carefully camouflaged, but were nonetheless uncomfortable reading for Zelensky. For example, he talked about the cost of this war, gave a figure that will be hair-raising in the capitals of the countries that are paying the $100 million a day. But the new defense minister wasn't even in post when posts of his predilections were all over social media. Kolomoisky, the man who's been the eminence grise in the rise of Zelensky, the man who funded Zelensky at the same time as funding the Azov Nazi battalions, has now been arrested, charged with theft of billions, I'm talking billions, from Privat Bank. There's every sign that things are not hunky-dory in the corridors of power in Kiev. Do you get that sense also?
Yes, I do. I mean, the important thing to note about the government in Kiev is that it's not really a government at all. They're a bunch of crooks, basically, on the American payroll, on the Western payroll. They, in that sense, the departure of Reznikov and his replacement by this improbable Crimean Tatar is unimportant, because if anybody's still running the Ukrainian army, I guess it's Zaluzhny. The Minister for Defense is a non-job. And Zelensky's job, really, apart from its public relations aspects, is a non-job. All the decisions are being made in Washington. And so the only question is, and it's been the question now for weeks, if not months, the Ukrainian so-called government, the Kiev regime, is terminal. But when is it going to be put out of its misery? And we still don't know the answer to that, because I have a little metaphor here, which will be quite offensive to some people, but I will make it because I think it's relevant. The regime in Kiev is looking more and more like the administration of the Gaza Strip, in the sense that they are absolutely powerless to resist a vastly technically and in terms of manpower superior Israeli defense force. Every now and then they boil over and they do something stupid and wasteful of lives, and the retaliation is swift and brutal. And then there's peace for a while, and then it all comes back again because there's this rage to, if you like, strike out for what they feel is their cause. And so the bloodletting continues very much on one side. That might be Ukraine's future for quite a while, because even though everybody knows the Ukrainian army is defeated, that they can't mount any more offensives, that they don't have the trained manpower to do it, they're just sitting back and licking their wounds. Meanwhile, the Russian army sits behind its incredibly strong fortifications with its crack troops ready to go whenever the order comes from Moscow to go. It's an amazing situation because we have a total defeat of Kiev already, but like the Black Knight in Monty Python, this legless rolling creature in the ground keeps rolling around and saying, have at you, it's only a flesh wound. I mean, this is Ukraine today. It's terribly sad. I mean, one laughs at the metaphor, but the situation is terribly sad for the people of Ukraine. And how's it going to end? Well, there are several ways it could end.
Well, that's my next question to you. But before we get to that, and sparked by what you said, as all of this was not just predictable, but was predicted, including by me once this whole thing began, and by many people more eminent and qualified than me, it begs the question, are we ruled by fools or by knaves? Fools if they didn't know that it would end this way, knaves if they did know but nonetheless pressed on regardless. What's your take on that?
Both fools and knaves. Excuse me just a moment. Blighty, go upstairs now. Go on. Don't come in again. Sorry, a bit of domestic interruption. Fools and knaves. They didn't know. They did know that Ukraine was vastly outnumbered and outclassed from the very beginning, but they somehow believed in this American dream that we're the good guys. Shazam, Shazam! Somehow we will come through this. They lived on vain hope. And knaves, because essentially they don't care. However much Ukraine suffers, it's essentially going to be part of the Russian world anyway. So the more it enters into the Russian world wounded and damaged, the happier they are, basically. And this is the ruthlessness of these people. And, one has to go back to the treatment of the American African slave population, to the treatment of the indigenous American Native Americans, to the treatment of the Philippines in the 1890s, of Cuba. These are a ruthless imperialist elite, and I think they're very like the Romans, actually. I've been reading a lot about the Roman Empire lately. There is this sense of self-worth, this implacable determination to prevail, this sense that we are better than other people, and we can either cajole, bribe, or beat them into submission for as long as we wish. The Ukraine war has become symbolic of a much larger issue, of course, which is the issue of the revolt of the global South and leading countries like Russia and China against this awful hegemony. And so we're living in the most historic moment, but poor Ukraine is at the fulcrum of it.
Let me put to you finally, Ambassador, the question in a way you put to me, the penultimate question of how's this all going to end? I thought in the beginning it would end in the partition of the country along the river Dnipro, but as the months have gone by and the level of commitment of the Russians has grown and grown, and the popular support at home, I no longer believe that that would be regarded by the Russian public and by the military itself as a sufficient gain for all the pain that has been caused and indeed endured. And that therefore it is now much more likely that the partition, if indeed there is a partition at all, will have to include the entire coast of the south of Ukraine, and of course including the historic city of Odessa. I no longer see any ending to this war without Odessa becoming once again a Russian city, leaving a rump, stump, landlocked entity in the west of Ukraine, which would then be, at the very least, vulnerable to incursion by the Poles, who have long regarded the western part of Ukraine as being actually part of Poland. What say you?
I'll go right back to the beginning of your question. And when I get to the last part, I hope I remember to get to the last part. I want to give you a little anecdote from nameless friends of mine who've been in Russia recently, people of Russian background. What they brought back to me was a very strong impression of a resolute and determined Russia, which has swung behind the need to prosecute this war to a proper conclusion, not to leave the embers which could fan into another war a few years down the track. I agree totally with your view that the idea of a partition down the Dnipro, leaving a very strong nationalistic Ukrainian state to the west, is no longer viable. The only thing that can be left to the west is a weak and neutralized state, so that any residual Nazism there will not be politically threatening to the Russian world again. Things have reached that stage, and I'll give you some more symptoms of this, some more, if you like, indications of this. My friends who were back in Russia, they were in a rural city which will be nameless, were struck by the number of fresh graves in the local cemeteries. Now, these were ordinary Russian people, not part of the Moscow or St. Petersburg elite, which so far has been relatively unaffected by the mobilization campaign for various career reasons and so on. But the ordinary people have certainly been going to the front in large numbers, and the dead have been coming back. Now, there's a well-accepted figure now of 400,000 Kiev regime dead and 50,000 Russian dead, a 1 in 8 ratio. Forget about ratios. Just think about those 50,000 Russian dead. Every one of them loved, cherished, with families, with parents, with wives and children. They're gone, those 50,000. How are the Russians reacting to this? Is there an anti-war movement? Are there people saying, we can't go on doing this, this is terrible? No, there isn't. There isn't. There is respect and admiration and love for the families of these dead 50,000 young Russian men. Their children will grow up in a welcoming atmosphere of love and respect for what their fathers did. This is what I'm hearing from my Russian friends. This is not my invention. There is a sense that we are a country now which is at war. Our young men are making the ultimate sacrifice in this war. We will never stop respecting and honouring them, and doing what we can to bring this war to a proper end. Now, obviously, that's not the opinion of everybody in Russia. And I was told that there's believed to be 1 million Russians, not 300,000, who've left the country for one reason or another. Now, not all of them have left formally as it were, refuseniks who leave the country for good and make a lot of noise about it. A lot of them are living quietly in various parts of the world, in places like Phuket and Bali. They're lying low. They're living off their savings. They're waiting for things to get better, and then they'll quietly go home. But the point of it is, the people who are left in Russia are the people who are fully committed to what is happening. Another indication, I was just reading Maria Zakharova's latest press conference from yesterday. And what struck me, I mean, Maria's a pretty strident woman, very, very strong, passionate woman. I've met her at a conference. But she is absolutely implacable these days. When you read her rhetoric, when you read what she says about the war criminals and what they're doing in Ukraine, this is not the voice of a government that's disposed to settle for anything less than a total resolution of the Ukrainian problem. I didn't say victory deliberately because the Russians don't regard this as a victory. They don't regard the Ukrainians as their enemy. Even though they're forced to kill them in huge numbers, that's a military necessity for Russians. And it is still not a war for them. It is a brutal, implacable, special military operation, and it will continue to the end. What is the end? I agree with you. It's hard to see Odessa being left within rump Ukraine after all this. And the fact that there were major air raids in the last few days on a little river port between Ukraine and Romania. Look, I forget the name of it. It's four letters, but it's a major river port and was a major entry point for Western supplies into Ukraine. That is, of course, the western limit of Odessa province. And I think Odessa province is definitely going to go to Russia. What will be left of the rump Ukraine? Not just territory, but territory under an effective security system which will prevent it ever militarizing itself or being militarized by NATO against Russia again. So we're looking at two parts of the solution: territorial solution and a political resolution in the area that remains in rump Ukraine. I don't think the Poles will move in. I think they certainly might speculate about it, but if they have a rump Ukraine pretty much neutralized, I think they'll close the books on the history and let it go.